About a month ago, there was a very alarming report in the media about the southern killer whales being emaciated and actually showing a physical characteristic that basically intimated that they were starving. Can you elaborate on this?
Yes, well, there has been some scientific evidence that the killer whales are not finding enough salmon to survive, to be healthy, to reproduce as well as they should. And in particular, what we call the resident pods. In British Columbia, there's a northern resident pod, a southern resident pod that also goes into Juan de Fuca and into the United States, and the transient orcas, or killer whales. Transients eat marine mammals. They'll catch seals and sea lions, but the resident orcas depend on fish, primarily salmon, and mostly Chinook, which is their favorite fish. And we're seeing so many declines of our wild salmon stocks on the coast that it's not surprising that we're starting to see losses in the killer whale population.
What's happening with the Chinook and the sockeye runs on the Fraser River? There's just been some scientific reports come out that they're being impacted by sea lice.
There are a host of factors that are affecting the health of salmon. Obviously, habitat damage, bad logging practices, urban development, toxic runoff from industry that affects their spawning habitat. Climate change may be affecting the survivability of salmon at sea. But there are also issues that are within our power to do something about quite quickly. And one of those is the proliferation of open net cage salmon farming pens along our coast and the sea lice that breed on those pens. There was a preliminary scientific study early this year that indicated that not only are pink and chum salmon in the Broughton Archipelago on the northern end of Vancouver Island being heavily impacted by the sea lice from the fish farms, but the out-migrating juvenile sockeye from the Fraser River are also running into sea lice from fish farms on their route north through the Strait of Georgia. And the infestation of sea lice on juvenile salmon can kill them. So we may end up seeing significant declines attributable to the fish farms.
How does this affect the killer whales down south?
Well, pink salmon are dying off because of the heavy infestation of sea lice in areas with high concentrations of fish farms, and the Chinook eat the pink. So if there aren't enough pinks to feed the Chinook, then there's not going to be enough Chinook to feed the orcas, the killer whales.
They did an inquiry here, actually. It was put forward by Premier Gordon Campbell, basically stating, and the results were that they suggested or made the recommendations that the fish farms be shut down or at least put in close containment. Why hasn't Gordon Campbell followed through on any of these recommendations, or any of the scientific reports, or any of the historical data?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question to say, why isn't the government taking action? There have been process after process after process in British Columbia looking at the salmon farming industry and its impacts and making recommendations. The legislative committee, the Sustainable Aquaculture Committee that most recently recommended these farms be moved into closed containment, is only the latest in a decade or two long series of investigations and inquiries into this industry. Why do governments not act? I think, governments are, at a policy level, they're very supportive of the fish farm industry, and it's mutual. The fish farm industry makes contributions to the political party as well, the Liberal political party, in this case the provincial Liberals. But the government is facing challenges in a lot of our coastal communities. We've seen major collapse of the commercial fishing industry, huge downturns in the logging industry, the forest industry. What are people in these coastal communities going to do? How are they going to make a living? Aquaculture was a solution that many of the political parties embraced at both a federal and a provincial level to say, well, here's a way to create jobs in these coastal communities. What they're they're so entrenched in their support for that industry that they're turning their backs on the science that's showing what a dangerous industry it is and how badly it might be affecting our wild salmon, which in turn affects other economic generators. The wilderness tourism industry, for example, is very reliant on wild salmon, which feeds the bears, which feeds the eagles, which feed the orcas, which in turn attract the tourists. The commercial fishing industry, although it's taken a pretty heavy hit, it still exists, and they rely on those wild salmon. So the provincial government's support for the aquaculture industry is at the expense of other businesses that rely on healthy wild salmon populations.
Well, to an outsider, it would almost look like both the federal and the provincial governments were purposely trying to wipe out the wild salmon stocks. And actually, with fish farms, they couldn't do it any better if they poisoned the rivers.
Well, there's certainly speculation that if wild salmon were to die out on this coast, that would open the door to damming more rivers, putting in more development, more of an open path for the forestry industry, which wouldn't have to worry so much about, salmon streams and protective buffers. I can't speculate whether that's the government's agenda or not, but certainly we can look at the East Coast. When the cod collapsed, one of the things that followed was the offshore oil industry. Maybe that is the developer's agenda, but if that's the case, I think what they're fundamentally overlooking is that wild salmon are the backbone of ecological health on the Pacific coast of Canada. The wild salmon nourish everything. They nourish us as human beings, but they also feed a multitude of species, the orcas, the grizzly bears, the coastal wolves, the eagles, other birds of prey, insects. Just that whole cycle of life rests on the foundation of wild salmon. The salmon even nourish the ancient old-growth trees. Many people have seen pictures of some of these magnificent coastal forests with massive 1,000-year-old cedar trees. In the riparian areas, the streambank areas, 70% of the nitrogen that fuels the growth of those trees comes from the carcasses of wild salmon. That was a study that was undertaken by the University of Victoria, looking at the source of nitrogen that's feeding that tree growth. So salmon are absolutely the backbone of that entire ecosystem, and everything's going to start to unravel if we lose the salmon. Thank you.